Welcome to the Volk Furs Podcast. I'm your host, Garrett Volk. The fur trade has a rich history dating back to the 1500s. How has it survived, and what is the future? I will take a look at the history of the fur trade, in-depth discussions on various topics pertaining to trapping, fur fashion, interviews with industry experts, and much more. If you are addicted to fur, this is your podcast. Welcome, everybody. Happy April 12th. Welcome to the Volk Furs Podcast. I'm your host, Garrett Volk. It's been a while since I've been on here, January, I think, but, you know, these months, January, February, it's time to put up fur and stuff, so I've been in the fur shed quite a bit and all that sort of thing. So I haven't had time to really do any podcasts, but got a good guest on tonight. I like to read books, and I came across this book, and I don't remember where I came across to that, but I really enjoyed it, and I'm like, you know what, gotta call him up, message him, say, hey, you want to be on the podcast? He said, yeah, sure. So it worked out, and I'm excited to have him on here, talk about trapping and living in the mountains and all that kind of stuff, and you'll probably want to read his book after this podcast and kind of get more of an insight into that. It's really a good book. So let's get on with it. So welcome, Zach, to the Volk Furs Podcast.
I appreciate it, man. I'm always humbled by intros like that. So I'm very appreciated and super excited to be here and chatting with you.
So let's get into the book. And I think some of the book, we'll probably get into some of your background and by itself. I like to read books. I like to read as much as I can. It all kind of started out with years ago. I got into my career field, and one of the big things to do was read books. So I just started reading books, and I'm like, I never used to like to read in high school, and got into my profession. I'm like, I got to read. And then I started reading all these other books, and I just like to read. And I'm not sure how I came across your book, but I like stuff like that, mountains, wilderness, hunting, trapping. I mean, the cover of the book's really, really cool. And I'm like, I got to read it. And Turning Feral, I mean, come on, man. That's like right up everybody's alley, right? Especially trappers, right? Turning Feral, living out in the wilderness. So read the book and really liked it. I'm really interested in your story because I've said over the past, few years, and I might get into a little bit of my background here once we get going, just so everybody kind of has an idea where I'm coming from with this. Feeling is, but I have a feeling, especially in my state, there was a generation, maybe my generation, I grew up in the 90s, that maybe got out of trapping a little bit and maybe didn't grow up with it as much as maybe the generation before me. And I see there's a gap between, my parents are late 60s and, I'm in my mid 40s and my kids are, anywhere from 8 years old to 22 years old almost. And there's a generation there, I think, that was kind of missed. So I've been trying to find stuff and read stuff. And when I came across your book and how you got into this when you were older and not as a kid, I thought, well, that's interesting. I'm like, what made him want to do this? So, and get into this hunting, and then you're trapping, you're living out in the mountains. I mean, you went from, and I'll let you talk about it, when we get into that, but it just really intrigued me. And it's I kind of like to figure out why things happen. And I have an IT background, and I know that you kind of have IT background as well. And you start wondering, well, why is this happening? I mean, that's kind of how I go about my profession. It's like, well, I can do this. Why does that happen? How does this work? So that's kind of where we came to. And I'll kind of let you start here, but I'm just intrigued how you came from your background into hunting and trapping at a not really young age, but and then just kind of are rolling with it now. It's really, really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. There's this kind of middle lost generation, and, I'm 35. Yeah, I'm 35. So, 10 years younger than you. And, that's the millennial generation, the most probably lambasted generation out there. And for some good reason, not for other good reasons. But, I grew up in the South Georgia, South Carolina. Grew up very suburban. I had plenty of friends that went to my high school that hunted, probably trapped. I just didn't even think twice about it if they told me. So hunting, trapping, fishing was always on the periphery for me.
Mm-hmm.
But for whatever reason, it just didn't catch my interest. Probably because my dad didn't do it, my granddad didn't do it, my immediate family didn't do it. But what is interesting to me is that that millennial generation, like we grew up mid 90s, late 90s, we were just little kids, right? And
Mm-hmm.
if you remember the 90s, like it was great. It was right before the dot-com boom.
Mm-hmm.
The economy was great.
It was simple.
It was simple, right? There was no, I mean, I remember when we got our first dial-up internet connection in like 99 and,
man.
the world opened up to me as a kid. But like you said, it was simple. I wasn't exposed to it, but we were also coached that if you just went to college, you could have the exact same life. And all of our parents seemingly were living high on the hog in these suburban neighborhoods, right? Like they had, we weren't really for want of anything. And I feel very fortunate about that. But at the same time, it almost became an expectation. I'm like, okay, if I just go to college, make decent grades, then I can have just a cushy life, right? Mm-hmm. But where I think things flipped on the head is, I did that. I went to college. I graduated in 2009. So I was in college when the financial crisis happened. When I left college, there were no jobs to be had, none. It was a situation where I was like myself, my friends, my peers were all kind of left with our hands up, like, hey, wait, we were told if we took on this debt, went to school, we'd have, this huge, great job career. And the fact is that just didn't pan out.
Right.
And our generation has just kind of been like one shin kick after the other, if you will, from the economy, all sorts of stuff. So it kind of made you get scrappy all of a sudden. And I think the people who got scrappy quick kind of came out on top and are doing okay right now. And then the others, I have so many friends who are just kind of, not that it's a terrible thing, but, the picture of stuck in the mom's basement kind of situation.
Right.
And it's sad. But I think to answer your question, that's really, I think it's our generation, as we were told everything was going to be great. And then reality just slapped us across the face.
So everybody kind of had to say, okay, now what? Mm-hmm. Now what do I do? I mean, I have had kind of the same experience. I mean, I'm grateful that I went to college and I was bound and determined to graduate in 4 years, and I graduated in 4 years and got a job, and everything's worked out okay. In fact, I'm just finishing up. I went back and got my master's, and I just finished up my master's here in about a month, so I'll be done with that. That's been 20 years after I graduated with my undergrad, but that's the thing. Everybody was so focused on going out to college right away, and maybe not experiencing some of those other. Let's get out of college and do something different, or out of high school and do something different than go into school right away. Mm-hmm. And I say that now with, up in, North Dakota here, there's a really good college that it's a 2-year college. And I think they're actually transitioning to 4-year here in a couple of years, but they specialize in a lot of trade jobs. Mm-hmm. And that is something that was not pushed on us when we got out of high school. It's like, you got to go to a 4-year college. You got to waste your money the first 2 years of college on classes you just got done taking. And then you have to somehow fit the last two years of your curriculum into 2 years without going to an extra year. But you got to go and get that 4-year college. And now it's like, man, there's people going to 2 years of college of accelerated programs that is just what they're going to go into, getting out, getting a job right away and making a lot of good money versus somebody that maybe has got like a generic, just for lack of a better term, a generic business degree that has 4 or 5 years of college debt that is not sure what they're going to do because there's a ton of things to do. That was never, pushed on us. It was like, you got to go to 4-year college. You're not going to be anything, and
well, it's funny you say that. I have become what I would call a trade advocate now. and I'll go into why, and it's similar to what you were saying, but I would go so far as to say it was pushed on us to go to a 4-year college, but it was actually almost demonized to try to go to a trade school. Actually, like my dad, I kind of screwed off in high school a lot. I didn't have great grades. They wanted me to go to college. And I remember my dad kind of printing out two fake things. One was like a college application and one was a hard hat. He was like, you choose one, but it was clear in his mind that one was the right choice and the other wasn't. And,
Right.
as I've evolved and, I did succeed in having a pretty good career in like the tech space. But the last 11 months, I went through my first layoff of a job, like my main day job 11 months ago. And I just now got a job again. But the only thing that floated our family in that time and kept us from having to sell our house was fur handling. And
Isn't that something?
I'm very thankful for that. But that was also by the skin of our teeth. And so much so that, I'm actually going to be doing night school for welding because I want to build a skill, which I wish I would have done much younger, that, in the event of losing another main source of income, I can actually live and support my family. And fur handling and trapping did it for us this go round. And now fur season's over, so had that been the case, I would have been screwed. But it came in just in time.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that after, and when the big recession hit back in 2008 and people lost jobs and all this kind of stuff. I was fortunate. North Dakota was pretty robust at the time, but still it was kind of you still felt it. But I always think to myself, and I've always wanted to go and get my master's in my field, and not that my current job requires that. It won't. I'm an IT officer at two local banks, and good community banks, strong businesses in North Dakota, and but it was the type of thing it's like I think a person should always try and learn more,
Mm-hmm.
even if it's something that's not even like. I'm an IT guy that loves to trap, right? I don't know many IT guys that love to trap. Well, I think I kind of met one now.
Yeah.
but that's not I grew up farming and stuff and everything like that. So to me it's not foreign, but to people that think of IT people or people that go to school for 4 to 6 years and work in corporate America, which I'd never worked in corporate America, luckily, because I don't think I would have worked well in that. But I think that it's always good for people to have other things they're thinking about doing. And look at your case. What would have happened if you didn't have that skill for those 11 months or a year?
Mm-hmm.
I think and people have to try and say, well, how am I going to learn this, or how am I going to have time to do this? I'm like, well, I always look at it as a risk assessing of everything you do in life. It's like, okay, what's a threat? Well, a threat's always you're going to lose your job or something's going to happen. I'm like, okay, so how are you going to mitigate that threat? Well, you're going to go learn another skill, or you're going to go do something else that maybe like a side hustle that you can make a little bit of money to help pay for something, And that's kind of how my fur business kind of started out. I was like, well, I love the trap. I like the, fur handle and stuff. And I'm like, this could be a little bit of a side business that could help do whatever. So yeah, I think it's good. I that's interesting. Welding is very, very in demand. Not a lot of people know how to weld, and if you're a good welder, you got lots of work. So that's cool.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. My great grandfather was a welder, like just a professional welder. So it's kind of in the family. And, I did a little bit of welding when I was like 14, 15. And then again, just kind of went by the wayside in pursuit of that degree that I never really ended up using. But, to fast forward a little bit too, though, you know, we as millennials were pushed to do the college thing despite the recession, despite all this. And, kind of despite the odds, I did come out of school. I worked for the government for a little while, lived overseas, came back stateside with my now ex-wife, and I cobbled together a career just like in artificial intelligence. Really hard nosed just to get it done, and where the book starts is kind of where I start to get disillusioned with I finally caught up to the parked car, so to speak. If I was a dog, I was chasing that parked car, and all of a sudden I had the white picket fence, the suburban life, and I was pretty damn miserable, to be honest. My ego wouldn't let me say that out loud at the time, but um, you know, finally got what I was promised, and it was not what I thought it would be. Oh, did we lose you, Garrett?
Oh, there we go. I was on mute.
Oh, cool.
Sorry. It's interesting when you first start your book and you're talking about that, about, you're just like, just this isn't for me or whatever. I wonder how many people go through that, because when I was reading your book and I've had thoughts like that before. I mean, some days I'll tell you what, some days I just want to go and live where there's no people, do what I need to do, live how I want to live, take my family and just leave. And I don't know what it is. I've always been intrigued with, um, you know, okay, so let me back up 1 second here. When I was getting out of college looking for jobs, and I know Montana at the time, Southwest Montana had a lot of, tech jobs in Bozeman at the time. I mean, it was starting to heat up a little bit with tech jobs out there. And I was like, I want to move to Montana because I really like the snowmobile. I wasn't into trapping at that time in my life, but I was into snowmobiling quite a bit. We'd go to the Bighorns and ride sled all the time. And it was something I really wanted to do. Later on, I found out my wife said, I wouldn't have went with you. So I'm like, okay, well, good thing I didn't go. But it was something about the mountains to me. And I'm not sure what it is because I'm a prairie guy. I live in the prairie there's no trees around here except for town. I mean, it's as wide open flat as you can imagine. And I like that. But there's something about the mountains and something about having a cabin somewhere. It's like, you know what? That's my cabin. That's my area. That's where I want to go. And when you talked about this in the book, it was kind of interesting to me how you step through that whole process and how you got into that. Very interesting. And I just wonder how many people that have those feelings now that of maybe like our generation that maybe was stuck in that situation of maybe not having those experiences because we were, pushed to do well in school and pushed to do this and pushed to keep up with everybody else and have time to experience all that. What do you think about that?
The byproduct of the book and the book being, at least by my standards, which is not, some standard of like New York Times best-selling, but, a successful book and selling copies has been the number of people that have reached out to me, whether that's through social media or through email, and just kind of shared their story of either, hey, I've had these same feelings and I thought I was alone. I thought I was on an island. And then I just shoved them down. And now that I've seen you do it, like I've considered it, maybe not, the both feet in full force, like I was fortunate
Right.
enough to be able to do, but, getting out west more or, finding whatever their version of the West is. That could be, the Caribbean to go spearfishing. That could be, the prairie to, farm or homestead, whatever the case is. But there have been hundreds of people who've reached out to say, I was feeling the same thing and I thought I was alone.
Huh, that's interesting. I mean, why do you think people are feeling that way though? Just because of what we've been talking about? I mean, that's one of the things that question that I can't really, put a finger on. It's like, why are people doing this like in their 20s or how old were you when you moved out and started hunting and moved out to Idaho?
29.
29.
I think it might have even been 30 because I'm 35 or 36 now. So yeah, I mean, I've been about 5 or 6 years out here now. And
I mean,
yeah,
usually at that age, at least up here, it seems like at that age, most people are, probably have a fairly, established job. It seems like years ago, people that age were definitely married already and maybe had one or two kids. Now it seems like the younger people up here, up in North Dakota anyway, are not getting married as young. But that's a really big leap, with all of a sudden at that age saying, you know what, this isn't for me. I'm moving out to the mountains. I mean, but my question is what triggers that? Like, is there some primal dates back to whenever that triggers that whole feeling? I mean, everybody's situation is different, I guess, but what do you think about that? I mean, there has to be something like the call of the wild or something like that, or is it just the missed opportunities as a youngster growing up and you finally realize that this is what I want to do?
I think you're right in that it's case by case for sure. But I mean, I feel like most young boys and girls, for that matter, you know, you have that call of the wild. Like that's why they have the book Call of the Wild. They
You're
have
right.
Where the Red Fern Grows. Like I remember as a kid reading those books and fantasizing about that lifestyle, even though I was a little suburbanite. It was never enough for me to like do a Huck Finn and say, "Hey, mom, I'm going to go paddle down the river." But I
Right.
always fantasized about it.
Right.
And then they just kind of got put by the wayside, and you're put on the track. You're doing your sports, you're doing school, and you just forget about it. At least that was my case.
Yeah.
And then growing up, right, I was chasing the dream that I was told I was supposed to dream or to get, right? I felt almost a responsibility to my parents, to my family, society, that if I didn't achieve those things that I was told I was supposed to, that I was a failure. Even if I had a beautiful family, even if I had a home, like in my head, if I didn't have like the things, the material possessions that you were told you were supposed to get at different tranches, right? Like mid-20s, you should have an established career. Maybe by mid-30s, you should have a couple of kids, be married, and have your nice home and be set, and then just start putting away in your 401k. That's the mentality I had, and it was that pursuit, and then the slow realization as I got closer to hitting those marks that it just felt so shallow. It was like that. This is it, just the house, having a decent car and having some money in the bank. Like what then?
That's interesting. That line that you said, this is it. So a little side note, I felt, in high school, when I was in high school, and I'll kind of, anyway, move on to what you were saying there, but just a little tidbit about that whole feeling of like, there's like a build up to this whole thing, right? When you're a kid, and it's like, okay. And well, I had a similar experience like that when I was in high school, and I always think about this and it's stuck in my mind, but where I went to school at, football was a very big sport for us, and we had very good teams over the years, and it was very good to be on the football team. And we were a small school, so everybody played football, but it was this is great, and this is, and it was great, and everybody enjoyed it. And there was always a sense of urgency and a sense of buildup, like, oh, this team, we're going to go somewhere and do this. And we had some good teams where we did go into the playoffs and stuff. When I realized that was going to end when I was a senior in high school, and I'm like, this is it. There's no college football for me, which at the time I wasn't really into that. I was more of a baseball player, and I played a couple of years of college baseball, junior college, but it was like, this is it. Like all this buildup, and this is what people work for, and they're fanatical for it. And when you get to be a senior in that last game of football, and you're like, this is it. We're done. Now what? Right. And when you said that to me, that triggered me and said, God, I remember that. It's like, yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, gee, I did all that. Now what? Well, I guess on to the next chapter. What am I going to do? I have no idea, because all I've been doing is playing baseball and football and basketball. But anyway, side note, I thought that was interesting that popped in my head. But you're mentioned about fantasizing about, you see these books, and when you're younger and you read this stuff and you see these TV shows or whatever. I had that same thing. I love the show Iron Will. I love the show, movie Iron Will. I love the Call of the Wild. I loved all that stuff. And you watch these old shows and you see these mountains and you see the, what's the Jeremiah Johnson movie? Like how much of a better show could there be than Jeremiah Johnson? I mean, so you think of this stuff but you don't get to do it. You can't live it. You don't get to do it because of the generation that we're in. That might be some of it. That might be like, well, now I can do it, or now I can do it, or maybe it's within my grasp and it wasn't before. Yeah, that's interesting. That's a good point. I like that point.
Yeah. And I think what's even more interesting, like I moved out west right before the pandemic, but I think the pandemic just put a stamp where I think everybody, not just the people who were disillusioned with their jobs, that was a millennial, but every generation that might have not pursued something that they wanted to, all of a sudden was forced to ask, is this it?
Mm-hmm.
As they're sitting at home or 6 feet apart from somebody, being, pushed to wear a mask, do all this stuff where the system that you were buying into all of a sudden wasn't supporting you anymore. You didn't have meat at the grocery store. You were getting in fistfights over toilet paper. And, you know, everybody had to ask that question. And I think that's probably one reason you see post pandemic, there is a lot more push for outdoor activities, whether that's hunting, trapping, hiking, being outdoors, because I think a lot of people realize that the promise we all were given is shallow.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of comes back to the person. It's like, and I tell my kids this all the time. I'm like, have a plan for yourself. Have a plan how you want to live your life. I mean, I'm not going to tell my kids what to do and how to live their life after they go to high school. Of course, I'll give them advice like a good parent will, but and give them suggestions and stuff like that. But I'm like, you have to have a pathway of how you want to, what do you want to do? And maybe I'm just speculating, but maybe when the pandemic came and everything shut down, and we didn't get hit too hard up North Dakota, and we were lucky, but it was still, very frustrating with everything that was going on because nobody knew. And of course now it's coming out that there's lots of stuff people knew but failed to tell us. But that's a whole different conversation. But maybe people got caught saying, gee, now what am I going to do? I have no idea, because this, like you said, this place was supporting me and I was doing this, and wow, I'm just a number. I'm just a number in the HR spreadsheet. I mean, now what? Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
it does. And I think a lot of people are realizing the whole gold watch mentality in corporate America doesn't exist anymore. You see
Right.
layoffs here, layoffs there. It's all about how you get to that bottom line. And it happens. And I think people are just realizing that, it is a lot more fragile than I think we were all led to believe or even got to witness in our lifetimes. And, to your point, like that fear that set in for a lot of people. And like I wrote out the pandemic in my cabin. So like you would not have known that COVID was even a thing up in Atlanta, Idaho.
Sure.
However, family everywhere else, like there was real fear for people, like what's going to happen. There was that curiosity of the system kind of breaking down. But I think what I find interesting and what I found when I came out west for the first time, it's the same way I feel when I go to the ocean to surf or do something, is I always feel so small. You step out into the Sawtooth Mountains in Idaho, or, the Tetons, or, wherever, you can't help but feel minuscule and
Mm-hmm.
small. And I think people who hadn't been out into wilderness, whether that's ocean or mountains, were forced to feel that way. Unfortunately, during the pandemic, where they felt small and had to ask that question of themselves, like, is this it? And unfortunately, it wasn't in a super cool place like the ocean or the mountains. And then,
Right.
you have to wrestle that existential question in your pillbox apartment in New York.
Oh, talk about miserable. I'm so glad that I wasn't. Oh man, just thinking back on that now. I mean, that's been 4 years already. I mean, I think, yeah, it definitely redirected a lot of people's pathways through their life, and probably some for the better, probably some not so good, and probably some that really had a wake up call. And it's like, gee, now what? Now what am I going to do? But interesting. So let's move on next. I mean, we could talk about that for a long time, and it's always interesting to me how that changes. Events like that. I always talk about with my wife or somebody else. It's like, remember back in high school or college when you decided what to do, whether to go to college or whether to, go with this person or do this. I'm like, think that pathway and how it takes you for the rest of your life. And the pandemic did that for a lot of people, and it's interesting. But so you're in Louisiana, you were living in Louisiana, you were flying out to DC or flying wherever to work, and
Mhm.
you're in corporate, the corporate job, and you started to get into hunting with one of your friends, right? You said in the book, or
Yeah, yeah. So, my ex-wife was an FBI special agent, and it was funny. It was all female FBI agents for the most part at that field office because they
really,
worked
huh?
violent. Well, they worked violent crimes against children, which is a
Oh,
very
sure.
thankless job, but one that I'm very thankful that there are people who do it, especially now that I have kids. That said, we had like a husband's club almost. It was kind of the opposite of what you'd see in like a 50s show about, the G-men. But,
Oh, sure.
you know, one of the other husbands and I, we were talking about food, right? We were both like athletes. I did jujitsu and always trying to figure out how to get an edge, trying different diets. And then, people started talking about game meat. And I was like, huh, I know my ex-wife's dad was a deer hunter in Tennessee. So I'm like, maybe I should get some deer meat from him. And we got some because he always had it on hand. I just never asked for it before. And we started eating it. It was really good. It was, healthier. It was cheaper, per pound essentially. And I was like, wow, we should really start thinking about hunting. And that's just, that coupled with, I can't lie about it. The social media at the time was right when, Joe Rogan and, a couple other archers of the, social media sphere were becoming more popular. And I saw archery. I'm like, well, that seems pretty cool. And picked up a hand-me-down bow and, started trying to fling some arrows in the backyard and started down the path of even just learning to hunt for my own food.
How long did that take you? Because I read your book and it sounded like there was some struggles. How long did that take you to, going from not shooting a bow ever to feeling confident enough to go and harvest a deer? I mean, was that I remember as a kid growing up, we always shot bow as a kid and we always tried to hunt and stuff and weren't really successful at the time. But, I remember as a younger kid, we'd always shoot bow in the backyard into a couple square bales or something like that, or into a target. And it just took a long time to be confident enough to actually say, I think I'll be able to kill a deer at 20 yards. I mean, going from no past, younger experience with archery, was that quite a process for you?
Yeah, it's funny when you have no exposure to archery or hunting, period. You take things with a grain of salt. Like I was like, oh, archery, that's no problem. Like I see people do it on TV shows all the time, right? Or turn on the Outdoorsman channel, you see someone shoot a deer out of a tree with a bow. That doesn't look that hard. Obviously, reality is much different. And to answer your question, it took me about a year. It was about a year from the time I got my first bow, screwed up every way possible, which I talk a lot about in the book. But, before I felt confident enough at 20 yards, and, the irony is the first hunt I went on was in a tree stand and I only ever shot like 20 or 30 yards flatland. Right.
Oh, sure.
A lot of variables that went into it as I started to get into what ended up being central Tennessee whitetail hunting from a deer stand at my, ex-father-in-law's, lease. But it took a year is the answer to your question on how long it took for me to shoot thousands of arrows before I felt confident to even draw back on a real animal.
The first time I ever drew back on a real animal, I thought to myself, okay, I'm going to let this arrow fly now. Am I going to hit the thing? And and as a young kid, you just shoot into a target and you don't really care. It's like, okay, I hit the target or whatever. And like you said, archery looks easy enough, but there's a lot of mental game to that, isn't there? I mean, it's just not all physical.
No, the buck fever.
Yeah.
I think about it a lot now as an adult, and I think, man, how much missed opportunity did I have because I didn't start as a youngster? But then at the same time, I think about young me, and I was so dumb, right? I would have done some dumb things, I am sure. Whereas as an adult, there was a level of maturity that I had. I had a goal clearly of what and why I was doing this. So I think I could be a little more maniacal in my quote training. I was putting a lot of arrows down range. I knew I didn't want to wound an animal. I knew I didn't want to, carry that. Whereas a kid, I might have just started slinging arrows, if I'm being honest with myself, and
keep shooting.
Yeah, exactly. And, so I don't know which one's right. My kids are going to grow up hunting, so they're going to have to wrestle and contend with things that I haven't had to as an adult. But yeah, it was a long time. And it was funny is, I ended up hunting at hunting lease with the buddy who I started with, and he was brand new to hunting too. So we were both learning to shoot, and, we spent a few weekends out in November in Tennessee, and, I shot at a deer, missed a deer. He shot a doe, and that almost felt like I had shot it. We were just so excited for each other that we finally connected on an animal. And as you read in the book, a little bit of hilarity ensued figuring out what to do with it afterwards.
I like that little couple pages or whatever it was about yeah, you know, finding out that the locker's not open,
Mm-hmm.
and I won't go into detail, let everybody read it, but I just thought that was I like that part of the book, because I can imagine this, because when you do something for the first time. And when I got into trapping, it was kind of the same way to me, because I didn't start up trapping when I was a kid. I didn't probably start trapping until I was in my late 20s, probably. Um, and just like, okay, now what? I mean, it's easy to
Mm-hmm.
go out and catch a trap an animal, so to speak, especially if you're trapping something like a raccoon or even like whatever. But it's like, now what? And so it kind of brought me back when you were describing that whole ordeal. It's like, okay, now what? It's like, okay, YouTube, and get the phone out and try to follow along. I mean, I was really with you there in that little snippet, and that was interesting. I enjoyed that part. That was, I mean, not that I like to see the struggle, but it just brings me back to where anything that I've done in relation to that, everybody has those same ordeals, and you have to work through it, and that it makes a person better for it. And I thought that was an interesting part of that chapter.
Yeah, and I think, for listeners, what we're talking about is, my friend and I, he shot his first doe, and it was a Sunday in East or Central Tennessee, and we had our plans all laid out to go take this deer to a meat processor, because neither of us had ever gutted an animal. And if you live in the South, you know that everything's closed on Sundays, and
Mm-hmm.
the locker was closed, and all of a sudden we were faced with a relatively warm day and this animal getting rigor mortis and starting to bloat up, and forcing us to face our fears of saying, I guess we're going to have to gut this animal. And I think, to your point, and one of the things I love about like this kind of trend of adult onset hunting is everybody has to face this at
Mm-hmm.
some point, of the reality of what it is to harvest any animal, whether it's trapping, whether it's hunting, fishing. Like, at some point you're going to have to put a knife to flesh and process it. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
there are cases like if you could take it to a locker and never do it, that potentially, but most people will have to face that if they want to get into hunting, trapping, fishing, and it's a life-changing experience. And I think one of the reasons I put that in the book was for people who have done it their whole lives, who might not think twice about, gutting an animal, to remember what it was like maybe that first time, because a lot of people aren't honest about it. And I tried to be as honest as I could about how I felt and how uh, hard it was to be able to do that on our own with just YouTube as our guide.
I felt like that the first time I trapped a raccoon. I had feelings of like, you trap this raccoon, and you might have went into a little bit on it when you were talking about a red fox or something like
Mm-hmm.
that. And raccoons look nice and cuddly and whatever. I mean, I'm going to admit it. I mean, they don't look, but they cause lots of problems.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, as a trapper, you trap them for the fur and all that kind of. Anyway, the first time I ever, trapped a raccoon, I I trapped a raccoon. I didn't know what I was doing. I went out there. It was early morning, I think, or late at night. I don't remember, to check my traps, and I saw these two eyes and in my headlights. I'm like, "What the heck? I got something," And I'm like, "Now what?" And you go up to this thing, and it looks at you like, "Okay, what are you going to do with me?" And you just get, that stuck with you for a long time, and
Mm-hmm.
it really hits you at the moment when you're about to do something, whether it be gut it, field dress and gut out a whitetail deer, or, dispatch an animal on the trap line that you maybe never done before, or you had to do it a different way or something like that. Like you said, everybody has to go through that no matter what at point, but it's something that sticks with you for a long time, and you really have to think through it, because it's easy to watch it, it's easy to talk about it, and until you have to do it, it's like, oh, this is real stuff. But I thought that was interesting. Now, another thing I thought was interesting is you're talking about that place you guys went to. I don't know if you're hunting, if it was deer you're hunting, or if it was hogs you're hunting, or pigs, and you got dropped off in the middle of the morning in the dark off a four
Mm-hmm.
wheeler or something like that.
Yeah.
I thought that was an interesting part, because when I read a book, I just picture how this was working, and I'm like, got these two young new hunters that are going to this place that they've never been to before, and then they're dropped off in the middle of these woods and they have no idea where they're at. And it's like, then there's all these sounds and noises, and it's there's nothing worse than getting dropped off in the morning somewhere never seeing it in the light, and you have to start hunting, right? I mean,
Yep.
I thought that part of the book was interesting. I liked reading that part.
Yeah, it was that was actually the first hunt. That was pre ever harvesting a deer.
That was okay.
Yeah, that was I had no well, this gets back to kind of like being a new hunter or a trapper. Like coming in, the regulation and rules are kind of daunting, right? Like it's really hard in some cases. Like you can find it online, but like figuring out, okay, I need to go do a field day. I need to get my license. I need to do these online courses. Oh, I'm going to bow hunt. So I have to get a bow hunting certificate, like,
Mm-hmm.
and it changes state by state. So it was really hard. So I was just Googling things and, I came across this, I'm using air quotes for people who can't see, an outfitter in rural Arkansas who clearly just had pig problems on his land. And he said, seemed like a nice guy. When I come, like, hey man, you're like, you don't need any license. You don't need anything. Just show up, pay me $200 and I'll host you for the weekend. You'll kill as many pigs as you want. So, kind of on a hope and a prayer, we ended up in rural Arkansas, and the guy was great. But to that end, right, first morning, pre-light, freezing cold, drives us out here in the middle of nowhere. He said, there's the corn feeder. And then he points to a tree stand and says, good luck. I'll pick you up at dark, And as you know, there was no success. There was a lot of sound. It was the first time I'd ever hunted. So I was really cued in. I was playing out every scenario I thought would happen, which none of them did.
Mm-hmm.
And, it was a mental battle more than anything.
Yeah. You described that perfectly. And I think that, that's a really honest opinion of how, or honest description of how I think it happens when people go out hunting for the first time. I mean, I really think that's like spot on. And I enjoyed that part because it's like, I'm not like as abnormal on my thoughts as I thought I was. Maybe everybody else has these same type of feelings. So,
it's interesting that I think that's an inflection point because I think most people do feel that way when they get out there. And I think we probably lose a lot of people too, right? Because if you have those thoughts, you're like, well, this is kind of a pointless exercise. And, it's like, well, I think I'm going to hang up my bow now.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of saying, if it was easy, everybody would be doing it. Well, it's not. And that's kind of the attraction to hunting, in my opinion. It's not easy and it's not guaranteed. And I've always said to myself, and I talk with other people about, certain things, and I don't talk to people about life too much, but I do think it's important that people doing a task or an activity like hunting or trapping or whatever, I think it's important for people to struggle a little bit at something. I think it makes them better people, and I think it makes them learn better. And that's the type of thing that, like you said, usually people say, this isn't for me. I'm going to hang up my bow. In fact, I'm going to go sell it on eBay tomorrow, because this hunting thing is not for me. It's like I said before, it's a lot of mental part of that to keep going on that. But then, and you probably can attest to this too. Mm-hmm. When you kill your first animal and you done it how you wanted to do it, and it's really rewarding, and you field dress it yourself, you take it back, you cut up the meat, you put it in the freezer, you feed your family. I mean, until that point, until you start cutting up, putting in the freezer, feed your family, after that point, it's all downhill from there. It's like, I'm doing this forever. This is what I want to do. Am I right there? Is that kind of the breaking point of, I don't think I'm going to do it? It's like, oh man, I am hooked forever.
Yeah. I think you hit the nail on the head. It's that gets to the primal thing. You talked about a primal calling earlier. I think I think we all might have that primal calling to some degree throughout our lives, but when you pursue that primal calling and you're able to actually fulfill on it, and then you see the reward, like with your family, like feeding them, like nothing's better than feeding a friend or a family member an elk steak or a deer steak, or I mean, even like we've done pulled barbecue beaver and people like it, and like there's nothing of a better feeling than like that provider instinct to say, you know what, I toiled for that, and we all get to reap the benefits and enjoy it. And that is what I think is always going to be the drawback for me. And I imagine, for most people out there.
Right. but I think, that feeling that you get doing that, I think
Mm-hmm.
that if other people could get to that point and have that feeling, they'd understand it just like that. And they'd say, this is why people hunt. And on the trapping side, the first time that I ever trapped my own animal, skinned my own animal, which it took forever. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
used the knife way more than I needed to use. There was probably extra holes. I mean, it was like I sold my first two coyotes to the auction years ago, and I'm like, they weren't the best fur. They were bloody. I tried to clean up as much as possible, but that wasn't the point. The point was I did something for myself. I saw through the whole struggle of it, and the reward at the end was a small monetary reward, but it was more about like, look at what I finished, look at what I did. And as a trapper, that's the finished product with what's put up fur is kind of where a person gets to. Like with a hunter, it's we put some meat in the freezer and we're going to feed our family for a couple months or whatever. That's the point that people sometimes don't get to. And I think if they would get to that point, I think that they'd be doing it forever.
Yeah, I think, even like in the whole recruitment of hunters, trappers is, taking someone along on that journey if you're in a position to show that end-to-end process to get people hooked early. Because I do think if you get someone there, they're going to stick around and
Mm-hmm.
they're going to be hopefully good advocates, good uh, signposts for the good that's in hunting and trapping. And we get washed in social media with the good and the bad, of course, but the large majority of people out there pursuing these things are doing it for food, are doing it for fur, and doing it for the right reasons. And it's pretty cool. It's cool to be a part of, in
Mm-hmm.
my opinion.
So you're in Louisiana, you do some hunting trips, and you decide to move out to Idaho.
There was a catalytic event in there of an unexpected divorce from
Right.
my ex-wife. So, there is I fully recognize that, being a little older and having an established career and then going through a divorce, it left me open to be
Mm-hmm.
able to go wherever I wanted to. And in that time, I'd visited Idaho once that previous year and kind of fell in love. It was right when I was flirting with hunting. And, I just said, I'm going to go there and I'm going to try to do the whole Jeremiah Johnson thing. And,
That's great.
my intent was to be like, all big game hunting, trapping, outside of what I'd seen in some movies, like which took up very small parts of my brain space, was not on my radar when I went out there either. It was purely to go and just have access to game for hunting.
Mm-hmm.
That was my only goal when I left.
So you picked Idaho for the
Mm-hmm.
simple fact that you visited there and you fell in love with it, right?
Yeah.
So how do you find I mean, of course you wanted to live, close to hunting grounds and off the grid as much as possible, kind of depicted in your book. How do you go about finding a place out there to live? I mean, you're coming from Louisiana, which is not the mountains.
Yep.
You're coming from corporate world, which is not the mountains, not Idaho for sure. What did you feel like going out to Idaho saying, well, now I got to find a place to live. Where am I going to live? How am I going to do this? I mean, what was the first year like? I mean, go from, flying in planes and flying around the world and, living, in I don't know if you're in a house or apartment or whatever, but it wasn't the mountains in a cabin. So what was that adventure like right away?
I've always been unafraid to try new things and unafraid to fail. And I've always, and you probably could pick up on in the book, like I've always been okay with laughing at myself at the failures and expecting them to happen. It was the same mindset with moving to Idaho. Like I had no idea what to expect. I ended up going and getting a little month-to-month rental in Boise. And from there, it was like my area of operations. I went and checked out everywhere in Idaho. I just pulled up Zillow and was looking at properties in my price range. There were some like little off-grid cabins in the Frank Church where I was like, oh, I could get there. And I'd drive up with a just as clueless real estate agent, realizing that it was a sled-in only place.
Oh,
I'm like,
no.
well, I guess I can't check that out. It was learning about Idaho very quickly the hard way and like what is accessible, what's not accessible, what's doable, what's not doable. And I just spent the weeks and weekends checking out these properties and ultimately found this place in Atlanta, Idaho, the smallest town in the lower 48 that is accessible by road year round. And there's very little turnover in homes there, and it was just in my mind, a God thing where there was a small cabin that backed up to national forest land that was well within my price range, and went and looked at it, and I said, "This is it," and that was it. Put it down payment down and moved in like a week later because it was already vacant.
So do you live in the same spot now then still? Or are you still there?
Yeah, we still have it. When I moved up there, I was freshly divorced, and now I have a beautiful mountain woman wife and 2 kids with another due any day now.
Oh wow, congratulations. That's great.
I appreciate it, man. We're number 3, and then I'm going to backflip into the vasectomy clinic.
Well, I'm at 5, and I had that procedure done right after the 5.
Yeah.
I was like,
Yeah.
5 was enough. I mean, I love kids, but at the time I was 37 years old, and I'm like, nope, not doing it anymore. So yeah, I understand where you're coming from, but yeah, that's great. Having kids is great. I mean, it's fun. I mean, sometimes it can be a struggle, but that's all part of it. But
Yeah, and it's a learning curve now, being up there with 2 kids, now another infant on the way. There's definitely like additions we need to do. There are things that need to be more livable, and us thinking about how we want to do this long term. Like, will we be there forever? And I'd love to be able to say yes, but I don't know. And I'm trying to leave myself open and not letting my identity be tied up just in the cabin, which it has been very much so for the past few years. But building a family up there has been the most rewarding and amazing thing that I was never expecting in my life. Like taking my daughter on my trap line, like that is the coolest thing I've ever done, and continues to be with my son. And now, whether we have a son or daughter, it'll be a surprise, and continue the pattern wherever we're at.
That's great. I mean, the kids don't know it now, but boy, they're really going to look at that when they get older and say, wow, that was great. I mean, I could about imagine just coming from what I would think it would be if I was a kid growing up in something like that and doing that. I mean, I what was I reading the other day? Or I read something the other day, which I thought was very, very interesting. And there was some study, some research about this. And it was some study. I don't know if it was done overseas or where it was at. They mentioned like a UK doctor, I think, or if it was a United States doctor. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But there was some study, some research done that kids at a younger age that were involved in the outdoors more suffered less from social issues, anxiety, depression, all this type of stuff that you're seeing more now of, simply because they were outside doing things. I believe it. I thought that was super interesting. I mean, I know that families are not like they were when I was in high school and elementary school being outside. I mean, you can't find a kid outside anymore. And that was very, very interesting to me. And that makes total sense. What do you think about that?
Well, I hope it's true, because that's, we're focused on raising our kids that way. And what's, Atlanta, Idaho, it really does feel like you're stepping back in time, right? I mean, we have the internet, Starlink, thanks Elon. So I can work, I can do other things. But you step out of our home outside of Wi-Fi range, you're only on or there is no cell phone service. And the cool thing is that everything we do is outside. Like we open up to 3,000 acres of national forest land. So our kids go and play outside. They play with dirt and corn and love it. But the other thing is, nobody calls CPS on me, but, we have a very small radius to take either a side by side or my truck around. Like if our Thursday night might be taking a little bit of built up trash to the town dump, which is a mile outside of town. And we don't buckle our kids into a car seat, right? They can sit on the front with us. They might sit in my lap because we're going less than 10 miles an hour or whatever. But, our kids know, like when we go down to Boise for shopping or whatever, they have to sit in their car seats and they're like, I want to be back up in Atlanta. I want to be back at the cabin. And that's the best feeling for me, is just allowing them a little bit more autonomy and freedom, even though they're as young as they are.
Yeah, I think I don't think that happens as much as it should. And my kids, I mean, we're guilty of that too. Just not getting out as much, and it seems like they get out of the house, they do more things. It seems it just affects them differently, and that's something that maybe is why, like we talked earlier in the podcast about that gap of a generation where maybe they don't have these you know hunting and trapping instincts because they were just missing out totally. And I think, I talk to people all the time about the fur industry and about how, a lot of these old fur guys, I mean, they're getting old, they're stopping, some are passing away, and there's a gap in there where there's not many people to pick up the thing. And I'm like, this youth and these kids, they're not as involved, and they're the future of course, they're the future of any industry, but when we're talking about trapping and hunting, they're the future of that. And the more that they get outside, the more they can, at least be educated about it. I hear a few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to go to our local school, and they were doing North Dakota studies, and part of their chapter was talking about the fur trade in North Dakota. And of course, it happened to be two of the grades that I've two of my kids are in, and we were talking around the supper table one night, and my wife suggested, well, why don't you go in and talk about your fur stuff? And I'm like, oh, that's a good idea. I said, if they'll have me, I said, I'll go in and talk about it, and so I went in, I took a bunch of skins in, and we talked about, the fur trade back in the, 15, 16, hundreds, and up at the 1800s where it kind of went away. And then, the current fur trade and everything like that. And I couldn't believe, especially the fourth graders, how many questions and how many good questions that these kids had about everything related to trapping and fur. And the thing that hit me the most is that I would tell them, answer them and tell them how it was and how we do this and that. And everybody was so engaged and so interested. I was not, expecting that at all. And I came away thinking, my gosh, these kids, they didn't grow up with this stuff, which, is no fault of their own, because it's just an industry that's getting smaller and smaller. And I'm like, these kids really like to learn about this stuff. And I brought some scrap fur so everybody could take a little scrap fur home. And gosh, they swarmed the box of scrap fur like it was gold or something. And it was so fun to be there and talk to these kids. Now the eighth graders, they're the junior high. They're not as interested, but they were still pretty interested. But that was something that I'm like, God, I need to do more of this. And that's the type of stuff that these kids are just, not being outside, not seeing it. I mean, in my opinion, they're, just losing that whole cycle of history. And it was really fun to do. So that was getting these kids involved in this stuff. I think it's just a big thing.
Well, I think it isn't just relegated to kids, because like I said, when I moved to Idaho, it was all for hunting. Trapping wasn't on my radar. It wasn't until I met an old timer up in Atlanta that had trapped that, the seed got planted, and I was like, wait, the fur trade is still a thing. So even as an adult, I was like, I read about it in books and, read history books, thought it was really cool, but I just assumed it was dead. So I was probably looking like those fourth graders when I finally talked to somebody who still actively trapped and said, no, you can make money at it. You can, harvest animals. There's laws and regulations around it. Here's the seasons. You can catch all these different fur bearers where we're at. And, that was a light bulb for me. So I probably looked like one of those fourth graders. And I swear if that old timer had like a box of scrap fur, I probably would have raided it too.
Yeah, it was a fun time, and it was really neat to see that. And I can probably remember the first time that somebody was talking to me about fur too. I mean, it was like, oh, I can sell this thing now and I can make a little bit of money. I had a couple of the eighth grade class, a couple of the boys that were asking most of the questions, and it was really interesting. Through the whole presentation, I was talking about, the money you can make and, what they make it for and all this kind of stuff. And towards the end I was there for about an hour for each class. Towards the end of that, it started coming in these kids' heads. They were starting to think, and it took them a little bit, but they're like, hold on a second. I can go do something like this and I can make money doing it. And that wasn't my agenda for the presentation. It was more about, just talking about fur trade. But these kids' minds just all of a sudden started thinking like, whoa, I can go and I can make something and sell it. I can trap something and sell it to a fur buyer. I can make my own hat or do whatever. And that was really interesting because they would never have that experience and not know that, because there's just not that much of a fur talk around anymore. So yeah, I can relate to that. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's an untapped thing, and it's funny because I know I have my own podcast now just on trapping, and it's all around kind of new trappers. But I'm usually interviewing people who have, quote unquote, trapping royalty, people who've been doing it for forever. But
Mm-hmm.
the kind of common thread is almost all of them, if they grew up trapping, they did it through high school, and they're like, man, it was good money, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was a side gig that I think most high schoolers who are either having to lifeguard or scoop ice cream somewhere to make a little extra cash don't even think about. But it's accessible. It's something you can do before and after school, and if you put your mind to it, you can make a decent amount of coin. And had I known the economics of it in high school, maybe that would have made my mind a little different, so I didn't have to make birthday cake ice cream for a bunch of douchey people.
I have a coworker that he was a trapper back in high school. He's probably, I suppose, probably 50, almost 15 years older than me. And he was telling me about those days. He ran his trap line before school. He's like, I could sell a red fox for $70 on the carcass as a high schooler. And I ran my trap line before school. That was good money back then. I mean, of course, $70 now was probably way more than that due to inflation. But I mean, you hear about that all the time. Some of these guys I buy fur from, they're like, well, back in the good old days, it was this and this and this and this. And I'm like, wow, people bought their vehicles off their trapping money. I mean, they'd buy their pickup with their trapping money for the winter. And that's crazy to me. That's crazy. And that's why people are into it. I mean, imagine if you could do that now. Of course, society's a little different, culture's a little different. There's not the demand as there used to be. But yeah, that was crazy. All the stories I hear about how good it used to be.
Well, I mean, the good as it used to be is always there, but it's still good. I
Yeah.
mean, like I said, after 5-6 years of trapping, by no means am I an expert. I'm a very moderate, okay trapper, small numbers. But when my back got put against the wall this past year to rub pennies together to pay the mortgage, I trapped harder than I'd ever trapped, and I was able to pay our mortgage through trapping for 2 months, and that floated us. And you can still make some money at it if you put your time in, right? And I think that's kind of the case across the board, and something I'm very thankful for. Is definitely fur prices are not where they used to be,
Mm-hmm.
but you can still make some moves and make a little bit of money if that's what you're pursuing.
That's a great, Zach, that's a great story. I mean, that, I really like that part about what you just said. I mean, your back's against the wall and you struggled, evidently you struggled at that because it was like, now I got to do something that, like you said, more work, got to make these ends meet. That's interesting. And that makes you a way better trapper for sure. I mean, you had to make sure that, you maximized your time trapping, and you probably indirectly learned how to be a better trapper at the time, I would say.
I'm sure. Maybe I graduated from okayest to, mediocreist. But yeah, there were still a lot of empty traps, and there were still it did accelerate my learning,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where I was a opportunistic trapper before, to where now it was like I'm doing this as a dedicated line to pay the bills.
Yeah.
Yeah, it definitely closed the gap, and I expect, or I hope that the next few seasons, even if I'm not with my back against the wall, and I hope I'm not, that where I set, I can expect to catch. Right? It's always the goal.
So what's your let's talk a little bit about what are you trapping mostly up where you're at? I mean, what's your go-to? Do you trap for everything, or you you like to really specialize in a certain animal or type of trapping? I mean, what's your game plan?
Well, I didn't realize how fortunate I was and where I bought property. Again, not having trapping in my mind at the time, but Idaho is fantastic for fur bearer trapping, right? Just
Mhm.
from the amount of fur bearers. So I started with red fox. There was just a ton up where we're at that's year round here in Idaho, and kind of started getting my canine trapping. I won't say dialed in, but playing with it. But it ballooned into everything. It was coyotes after that, and then there's about 5 wolf packs running around and really focusing on wolf. And then what really captured my soul was when I finally bought a pair of waders and decided to Jeremiah Johnson myself and experience the water trapping, um, and doing beaver and otter.
Mm.
I would say that's my favorite. And then what put me and helped me through the time this past 11 months that helped me pay the bills was actually pine marten. That was where I was actually able to make the most money and pay the bills. So the answer is everything, but my heart is definitely in the water.
Really, that's interesting. Have you had success at catching any wolves?
One,
One.
one single after you read in the book, I had not caught one, and
Yeah.
then this past season finally connected.
How
But
many
that's
hours do you think you had into catching that one wolf?
yeah. do you do you include the other seasons of not catching a single thing?
All I think about with wolf trapping, and I'd love to chase wolves someday, and it's just not feasible now based on where I live and the time it would take to really concentrate on something living so far away from the habitat and stuff. But the one thing that really struck me as this animal is like the top of the food chain next to the humans, right? They're smart, and I don't know nothing about wolves, but just for what I read and from what I pick up from everybody, the first time I read that said that, yeah, a wolf might travel 25 miles overnight. I'm like, what? I'm like, you're kidding me, right? Well, no, they just get on a trail, they just go. And because they have a big area, I'm like, I want to say, how the heck do you trap a wolf? Do you wait of course you have to wait. If they're not in an area, they're not in an area like anything else. But to trap a wolf, and I suppose the people that trap all the time, after a while, they get to know how to do it. But that's got to be going up against that's like going up against the best, isn't it? Trying to figure out how to trap a wolf.
Oh boy. I mean, an animal that is way smarter than me. And, it's unfortunate to see the thing that happened in Wyoming with a, guy who ran a wolf down with a snowmobile
Yeah.
and paraded it around. But it's hard for a lot of people who are not trappers or hunters to recognize and realize that people who pursue animals, especially if you really get into one, like I've done with wolf and beaver, is like you actually grow a really tight connection with those animals. And like for me, wolves, call it a spirit animal, whatever, they're just so smart. It
Mm-hmm.
is the ultimate test, and it's one that I've only succeeded at one time, out of months of dedication and trying and boots on the ground out in the wilderness, moving traps. And you learn a lot, and hopefully I'll be more dialed in as seasons come. And now I kind of have patterns down and whatnot. But good Lord, they're smart. Right up to your trap, turn and pee on your pan or dig it up and don't, again, you learn stuff, but it seems like they have the sixth sense of, you know, anywhere you set
Do,
for the most
do
part.
you think they're unpredictable, or do you think that I mean, evidently their senses are just out of this world. I mean, I'm assuming as long as their nose is, they probably smell things from 20 miles away. I don't know. But are they unpredictable? Are they like like a step below a human as far as critical thinking, but a step above like the normal raccoon? Or I mean, just for comparison's sake, I mean, they must be critical thinkers to a point to be able to elude trappers, don't you think?
Well, I mean, by that definition, they're better critical thinkers than I am and where I set my traps
Right.
and how they avoid them. And you'll see like they're on pretty good patterns of like they cover a lot of miles, but you know, I was talking to Paul Ansack and from Mountain Men, and he was saying like you don't pull traps. And that's something I've done. Like, it might be 10, 12 days, no,
Mm-hmm.
nothing. I'm like, I'm going to pull and set somewhere else. But, they're on these cycles and it might be 30 days before they come back to that area. So there's a dedication also with getting steel out and on the ground, which is also not inexpensive. And, they can be patternable, but they're still just critical thinkers, like you said. And, they might not be better critical thinkers than most humans, but they're better critical thinkers than me. And that's kind of where I've landed with them at the moment.
They know how to do things in their environment, and that's the big thing. They must just, I mean, he's speaking about spirit animals, and I'm not sure how a person defines a spirit animal, so to speak. I define it as something that maybe for myself, I've always been fascinated with coyotes, and I don't know why, because I think when I was younger and you're out hunting, and when you're a lot younger and right about, sunset, you'd hear all these coyotes, and they sound like they're like 5 feet from you, right? You're out deer hunting. And I'll be honest, when I was younger, it gave me a little bit of an uneasy feeling. And I was like, okay, you got to be kidding me. Are they gonna come after me when I'm walking back to my pickup? I mean, come on, right? I mean, I'm not gonna die by the tooth of a coyote, right? I mean, this isn't my time to go, right? Of course, when you're younger, you think about all this stuff. And once I started trapping a coyote and trying to figure out, and I still haven't figured them out. I mean, and I haven't done a whole lot of trapping the last couple of years with my fur business expanding and being busier in the shop more than out trapping. But I come to, first of all, they don't make me uneasy anymore. Of course, you be around them so much and you start to understand them more and you understand the animal. And they just made such an impression on me because they're so resilient, especially up here in North Dakota where it's 30 below in January, the 20-mile-an-hour wind. They're laying out in a snowbank, right? I mean, most people would freeze to death in 5 minutes. These things are so, they've tried to be exterminated throughout the last several hundred years. Nobody can exterminate them. They're so tough. They're so adaptable. Sometimes I don't think they're as smart as they seem, but they are really smart. It's interesting about spirit animals, and I'm not really classifying that as a spirit animal for myself, but when you connect with an animal to the point of you're so intrigued by them and that's all you think about, is that what a wolf is to you?
Yeah, it is. And, I was talking to somebody in the trapping world. I can't remember who, but he said something similar. He was taken by a coyotes, whether you say spirit animal or not, but an animal that takes up a lot of your conscious thought. He's like, you know what? I will never live somewhere where I can't hear coyotes howling at night. He's like, I've become so attached to them. Like, I don't want to see them, wiped off the face of the earth. Like a lot of people think trappers or hunters might want to see for an animal. Like, I want them regulated. I want them to not be causing harm where they cause harm, but I will never live somewhere where I don't hear them. And that's how I feel about wolves. Like, occasionally we'll hear the wolves going off our back deck in the cabin, and it's amazing. And I don't want that to go away, but I also don't want to drive down my road and see 6 elk half eaten, along the way as well. So it's a weird balance to strike, but yeah, I think you're right on that.
Yeah. It's always been, I could, like I said, the coyote and the wolf in your sense, it's just something that, and I agree with what you just said about that guy you talked to. It's like, yeah, I mean, you're thinking about that all the time, in the back of your mind. It's always something that passes through your brain waves once a day. And I think if that happens, I think that's what that probably means, in my opinion. So that's interesting. I mean, it sounds like you trap quite a few things up there. I've always been interested about pine marten, and I'm not sure why. I think it was Marty on Mountain Man when that show first came out, and he was trapping marten, and I'm like, that looks really fun. We have some marten in the Turtle Mountains. They're not really mountains. They're just they're hills. They call them Turtle Mountains. And there's pine marten in North Dakota. We don't have a season for them. And there's some studies by the Game and Fish that they're starting to do to see if there's enough for a season. But I thought they'd be really fun to trap. Are they fun to trap? I mean, are they easy to trap, or what's it like to trap pine marten?
Well, where I'm at, I'm really the only trapper. So, I have not had to do and contend with a lot of what I see online with trappers, like where you have like rubbing elbows and people stealing traps, anything like that. So trapping pine marten, I think, are similar to beaver in so much that it is not the hardest animal to trap. you can make something trap shy,
Mm-hmm.
but you get some good stinky bait. You have a nice box and a conibear set up. Like, you can catch martin pretty regularly. Now, when I said that I was actually making money on martin this year, like, I got lucky in that I got a contract with AFWA, which is the Association of Fish and Wildlife Association, to live trap martin
Cool.
this year, to do studies, essentially. So they were being sent off to the lab, the carcasses, to kind of check the efficacy of live traps, because they're, save all that data and information to make BMPs, which is best management practices for trapping, as well as like using it in, litigation or anything else to say, like, no, trapping is not being extra harmful to these animals. It's humane, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
But I was tasked with live trapping in these metal, have a heart cage traps with a nesting box martin, after a few seasons of catching quite a few martin. And that delta between just using a conibear and a martin box to trying to get a wily animal to step into a metal cage trap in the woods was really hard. So if you're going to live trap them, there's definitely some nuances and things to consider versus, with a martin box and a conibear, which, can be easier if you know where they're at and what their patterns are.
Someday I'm going to try to trap a few martin. I think it'd be kind of cool to trap martin, especially close to where I'm at. Like I said, about an hour away, there's definitely martin habitat, and once the season's there, I'm going to definitely try. So that's interesting. So what's your future? Are you going to be writing another book since you did a really good job in the first one, or what? You got something else cooking, or?
Yeah, I mean, I like to write. I've always written. So I've actually written a few fiction books called The Bone Scraper. I'll send you some copies, but it's actually about real Idaho history, just fictionalized. The first book's actually based in Atlanta, Idaho, and it's all about, the Chinese immigrants that were there that used to scrape bones and send them back to China. But it's a Western. Think Louis L'Amour.
Okay, cool.
Quentin Tarantino. So violent, but cool.
Geez.
The second one goes down to the Awahis, and I'm still working on the third. But, I'm actually, and I talked about this on another podcast a while back, is one of the things that has most endeared me to the trapping community. And, I started out here thinking I was going to be a hunter, and I am, but the trapping community really was open and kind to me as someone coming in to learn, whether that was through like Idaho Trappers Association, Natural Trappers Association. People were nice, and it was very welcoming. And I would consider myself a trapper, hobby, of course, but a trapper over a hunter. And to that end, I started a podcast called the Okayest Trapper Podcast, where I'm interviewing people I look up to. I'm interviewing other new trappers, and, learning what it's like to kind of get into this lifestyle, whether you're a teen, whether you're an adult, and what it means, like, on the whole spectrum, whether you're an ADC trapper or whether you're someone who, catches 2 martin every year just to make some mittens, right?
Right.
But with that, I'm talking with a lot of people, and what I've seen is an undercurrent of what it means to be a current outlaw, right? Because, by some definition, trapping, hunting is kind of on the spectrum of outlaw. Like, obviously we're doing it in a very regulated way today, but it still kind of harkens back to that, I want to live my life my own way. So I've been cooking up a book about what it means to be a modern outlaw. And that's something that I'm, very early stages, but something I hope in the next 2 years it'll materialize into something that's worth reading. But that's what's on the docket for me right now. So just podcasts. I'm working on that book, and I'm, running for a board seat for Idaho Trappers Association to see if I can help out there. And
cool.
That's about it for me.
That sounds like you're knee deep in lots of stuff. Then that's cool.
Yeah, man, definitely. Don't have the habit of not staying busy, and obviously trying to trap and plan hunts and raise kids and keep a job all in the interim. So I don't have enough on my plate, apparently.
Well, I got a pretty busy schedule as well, and I always say I just need like another 4 hours during the day that I can do some stuff. And I'm like, no, then I'd be busy doing something else. Well, Zach, thanks for coming on the podcast tonight. like I said, when I read your book, I'm like, I gotta get you on here and talk. I like to have conversations with people. I'm kind of a social person, like to just talk. And I was like, the book was great. I really enjoyed reading it. I'm hoping someday there's a Turning Feral part 2. I'm not sure what that would be for you, but I really enjoy your style of writing, and it was good. So thanks for coming on again, and I hope everything works out with the new baby on the way and new endeavors and stuff like that. And I hope that you would agree to come on my podcast in the future.
Yeah, I mean, anytime you want, and I appreciate it. And I think this is what the trapping community needs, is to have people on, just having open conversations. You know, whether you're, like I said, that full-time trapper or a hobby trapper, and realizing we're all rowing in the same direction and trying to keep it together for all of us. So I appreciate you doing that and having these conversations, and it was an absolute blast, and look forward to coming on again soon.
Thanks. Okay, everybody, that was Zach Hanson. He is the author of Turning Feral. And if you guys want a good read, please go and find that book and give a good read if you like to read. It's a very good book. Definitely something that if you're in the trapping hunting world, that you'll enjoy it. So, I'm trying to get some more podcast episodes up here now. First season's kind of slowing down for me in the first shed. I got some stuff left, but I might find some time to definitely get some more people on here. So if you do have any suggestions, you can always email me at info@volkfurs.com. Also remember, I do have an Etsy shop. I'm making quite a few things nowadays. If you guys need something for next winter, this summer is a good time to get that order in. So give my Etsy shop a look. Really like making hats and mittens and stuff like that. So I guess until next time, take care. Thank you, everybody, for listening to the most recent episode of the Volk Furs podcast. If you have any questions or comments, suggestions, please email me at info@volkfurs.com. You can find us on Instagram and Facebook, or you can contact me via my website at volkfurs.com.